Hey everyone, it's Peter Cole, and I'm back with another video in my Intro to Orchestral Sample Library series. So this is a series I'm doing for beginners. And right now we're actually going to take a little bit of a break and do a kind of a mini series just on rhythm and percussion. So focused on the percussion elements of the orchestra. So it's going to be a series of short videos. I'm trying to make these short. I know I always say that and they end up being really long, but we're just going to cover one little topic each time for a series of videos related just to rhythm and percussion. And this first one is all about the kind of the family of instruments that are part of the orchestra, the family of percussion instruments in the orchestra, and their frequency ranges. So frequency range, right? That's something that we think about all the time. Or maybe you don't think about it all the time, but it's a little more natural when you think about it with maybe orchestral stringed instruments or the brass. We think about, the low bass and the high violins or the high wind instruments, or the low tuba. Well, it's the exact same thing with percussion. You have low percussion, you have like middle range percussion, and you have the high end percussion. And the first step is kind of just understanding where each member of the orchestral percussion family lives in that frequency range. And on the subject of the orchestral instruments themselves, I'm going to start off just by saying I'm really, at this very first intro video, just going to be talking about really basic percussion instruments that are more traditionally seen and heard in an orchestra. And I'm bringing that up because I'm going to switch over to my screen here. There's incredible libraries out there like Damage, for example, by Heaviosity, one of my all-time faves. And there's a lot of percussion libraries that have a similar kind of approach where they take maybe a traditional orchestral instrument and then they just tweak the hell out of it, right? They process it, they distort it, maybe they blend it with other instruments. Heaviosity mixes up in their Damage collection, they're mixing up sounds from a junkyard, they're hitting with things with crowbars, they're breaking glass, all these really awesome sounds. And everything we're talking about here today regarding frequency range and other aspects of how to work with orchestral percussion applies absolutely to what you will hear in Damage, but just for the sake of making things a little more simple and straightforward, I'm not going to be getting into the Damage libraries yet. Maybe down the road, that'll be a cool future video. Instead, I'm really focused on just simple, straight ahead percussion from an orchestra. And so I'm going to bring up a library that I use a lot just for my bare bones percussion in the context of a orchestral production, and that's Rhapsody Percussion by Impact Soundworks. Really awesome older library, but it still holds up. Use it all the time. So what are those instruments that we see in the percussion section of an orchestra? You got a lot of these things will probably sound familiar. You got your bass drums, your snare drums, cymbals, shakers. You got metals such as hi-hat and triangle. We love our triangle. And you can see a lot of those included in a lot more, in fact, within this orchestral percussion library, Rhapsody Percussion. So that's why I bring it up, because it's just a simple, straight ahead orchestral percussion library. Of course, you can use any one you want. Some percussion instruments that are part of the orchestral family produce a tone. They're called tonal percussion instruments, such as the piano. Believe it or not, piano is a percussion instrument. And of course, it's quite possibly the most famous tonal producing instrument ever, right? Everyone knows what the piano is, but it's a percussion instrument. Similar xylophone, marimba, a lot of the mallet instruments, even wood blocks can make tones. Another extremely popular one that you're going to see in all your orchestral percussion libraries is the timpani. And timpani are those big, huge drums. They almost look like a big barrel of something. And they make that big, boomy sound. And they produce a tone. And you can actually play a melody. You tune the timpani and you play melodies with them. So for the purposes of this lesson, we're not going to get into the tonal instruments. Again, we're just kind of keeping it straightforward and simple and just focused on the frequency ranges of more traditional non-tonal percussion instruments. All right, so let's talk about frequency ranges. So I'm going to open up a really helpful plugin. It's called Span. It's a free plugin, by the way. If you don't have it, definitely check it out. I'll leave a link in the description of this video if you want to check it out. It's free, at least it was last time I looked, and it's a frequency spectrum analyzer. Now, there's a lot of these out there. In fact, I believe there's one that comes with Logic and with the DAW you're using as well. So it's not like some super rare thing that extremely common, but this is just a really, really good one. And I love it because it's got a big screen, so we can see everything happening here. So obviously over here on the left, you see that 20 there. That's 20 hertz. That's the low end. The deep bass, rumbling like sub bass, in fact, all the way down there. And then all the way at the extreme opposite end is that ear-piercing 20 kilohertz, which, you know, when you get older, you might not even hear that at all. You might not hear either of them when you're older. So that's the spectrum. Now within there, we will then have instruments that, of course, take a spot in that spectrum. And I'm not going to get into mixing and all that. That's a whole nother lesson down the road, of course. But it's a very similar concept when we're talking about orchestration. And in this sense, we're talking about percussion orchestration, but it's going to be the same when you're working with strings and brass and other instruments as well. It's the exact same idea. You have frequency spectrum, and you want to, if possible, you want each instrument to kind of own its own space within there. The more instruments kind of cover each other up and share the same frequency ranges, of course that's going to happen. We can't avoid it. But the more they do that, they can cover each other up, and it becomes a little harder to hear what each instrument is performing individually. So the more you think about where an instrument sits in that spectrum, and you do your best to carve out a space for it, and by carving out, of course, I mean you don't overlap a lot of instruments with the same frequency, or you have them play at different times. So you might have a mid-range instrument kind of taking the spotlight, and then it goes away, and then it's replaced by a different mid-range instrument, or maybe it's played softer. These are all really important concepts of orchestration. That's really what makes orchestration so powerful, because you're not just messing with your DAW and your EQs and your fader, which of course we all have to do when we're playing in our DAW and in our mixers. But if you go back 100 years before they had all this stuff, all they had was instruments playing in a room somewhere, and those concepts had to be controlled by the players and by the orchestration, how it was arranged, how the composer, and when they were writing their music, they were aware of the frequency ranges, believe it or not, and they composed with that in mind because they wanted to create a performance and a composition in which each part was clear and you could hear each instrument. Now, within this frequency spectrum, it's become common to break up there's this big band here from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. There's this common practice to break up this into smaller bands. So as an example, the low end is a range within there, right? And then there's the middle range, and then there's the high range. So there's different ways to break it up. Generally, I like to go from the low of 20 out to about 100 as my low end. And then I actually break up the mid-range into two separate bands. I have a low mid and a high mid. And that's just because if I didn't do that, the mid-range would be so big that it kind of would defeat the purpose of banding it like this, right? What's the point of breaking it up when it's still a huge section? So from there, I usually go 100 to 1K. And by the way, you can kind of see how Span here is following me, right? They have this kind of, you can see the lines here. There's your 100 hertz down to 20. which is the low end. And then you go from 100 up to 1K. That represents my low mid. And then from 1K, I take it up to 6 or 8, kind of in there. Let's just say for today, let's go up to 8. That would be my mid high, and then 8 upwards all the way up to 200, or sorry, all the way up to 20 kilohertz is the high. And again, you might see this written different ways. For example, I've seen the mid broken out down into 3 parts. So then you actually have 5 bands. You have your low, I guess you have your low mid, you have your mid, high mid, and then super high, I guess. You can break it up, how you want. I've done it that way as well, but it's mostly just for you to think about in your head how you're orchestrating the different frequency ranges of the instruments you're using, right? So it's not like you're going to get arrested if you do it different. I hope not. And then, so if I were to then, knowing this, start thinking about the instruments in the orchestra. So let's think about the bass drum and the timpani. Well, certainly they're going to be down here in the low end. You got your toms, other mallets, perhaps. I know we said we weren't going to talk about tonal instruments, but you got your mallets. They're probably in the low mid as well as the timpani, because the timpani is pretty broad. It can go deep and it can get higher because, again, it's a tonal instrument. So you got your timpani in the low mid. High mid, we start getting into our snare drums, wood blocks, other mallets. They're in the higher end of the mid. And then the real high part, we're talking about cymbals and the triangle and other metals. They're up there in the higher. So they're up 8K and above. So again, step 1, you map the instruments to the frequency ranges. Step 2 is you make sure your frequency ranges are covered. So make sure you have an instrument in each one of those frequency ranges so that it's a full sound. However, of course, if you're writing a piece of music that doesn't require all these instruments, or maybe it's a soft piece of music, or maybe it's a very low-end, heavy piece of music, of course, you don't just force instruments where you don't need them. That's not what I'm saying. But in general, when you step back and you look at the frequencies that you have available to you, think about the full spectrum and where each instrument's going to sit, including your percussion instruments. If you are going to use a snare drum, for example, you know that it's going to fit there in the mid to high range, right? If you're going to use a bass drum, you know it's going to fit there in the low end, definitely, right? So now right there, you've got a couple of ranges already covered and you've filled those. You don't need to add more bass drums or more low end. I don't want to say no, don't ever do it, but see the point? You don't need to keep layering the lower ones. If you're going to start layering, consider layering other instruments that are not already covered in the spectrum that you've already filled. So if you've already filled the low end, don't keep filling it. You now think about filling the low mid or the mid or the high, right? So that's the idea. Again, we're trying to create a simple space for each instrument to live within the full frequency range so that we can hear it. When we cover them up and layer them with the same frequency, or an instrument with the same frequency, then it becomes harder to hear each one because they're literally stepping on each other's toes. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to play an incredibly simple piece of drum music. I wouldn't even call it music. It's so basic, but the whole idea is just to look at the different frequency ranges of the instruments. So we're going to start at the bottom, the low, with the bass drum. I have a very simple bass drum, and if you look in span here in the frequency spectrum, obviously no big surprise, it's taking up the low end. So it's particularly around 80 to 100, but it's filling up down all the way at the bottom, even getting a little bit of 20 in there, which is nice. You want that nice boom lower end bass drum in there to hold your low end. Then what I'll do is I'll go to the low mid, and here I just use some toms. And here, now look at this. This is very interesting. the toms are taking a pretty wide spectrum, right? So they're not getting any sub frequencies. They're not interfering with the super low, but they're peaking at about 130, 140, 150. So low mid, right? But they still have some character in all the way up to about 8K. So these instruments span the spectrum. But the good news is this guy will probably not clash with the bass drum. It will let the bass drum sing through. Real quick, let's do the mid-high. Of course, this is the snare. Again, you can see these mid instruments, man, they really take up a lot of space. So you can see right here that snare is kind of on the low end, it's about 200, and it's going all the way up. You've got even a little bit of 15, 20 kilohertz on your snare drum. So it gets high. And then I think I have a shaker for the very high. And of course, this is a great example of an instrument that is just kind of bleeding out there at the very, very high end. You're not getting any low. So hopefully you could kind of see what I just did there, right? Low is all the way on the low 20, 30, 40 bass drum, and then we start getting in the middle section. That's where things get tough. That's why the mid range is always a tough area to orchestrate, to mix, to EQ, because there's a lot of instruments kind of filling up that mid range. And then the high end is kind of dedicated to that shaker, kind of sitting off by itself, way up there in the 8 to 15K range. Now let's play all of them. And when I play them all, you can see a nice, well-balanced frequency spectrum. That's your bass drum, kind of locking in that low end, and you got it going all the way up to the high end. You know, like I said, incredibly basic piece of music here, but just want to give you the idea of how to carve out a space for each instrument you're using. Now, if I wanted to add instruments to this, if I felt a need to, one advantage is at least I have an idea of where my current instruments sit in the spectrum, so I can be conscious of if I'm going to start stepping on somebody's toes. Maybe I'll drop out the snare drum, for example. If I want to bring in an instrument that's going to compete in those frequencies, I might drop the snare out for a little bit, right? Let that other instrument come through. So it's just a way to think about orchestration, because this is orchestration, what we're talking about. It happens to be in the context of percussion instruments, but it's the same general idea. How do you orchestrate all these instruments and in a way where you're arranging them so that they're not overlapping and stepping on one another? All right, so one more thing. This is going to be step 3. This is the last thing we're going to go over for this video. And this is talking about how to arrange the percussion. So we're talking about the compositional part now. So step 1, you've mapped each instrument to its frequency range, right? So you know where it sits in the larger frequency spectrum. You're now in step 2 aware of where each of them sit, and you're trying to fill the full frequency range, assuming your composition calls for that. But either way, you're aware of where they all sit. Now, step 3 is the last part is starting to write for them. So now we're going to talk about, well, how do you go about writing for each of those instruments? And these are some just guidelines, things that I think about when I'm writing percussion. And the first thing I think about is keeping the low range simple. So what do I mean by that? Well, you have a bass drum playing, and if you heard in that piece of music I just played, the bass drum was doing a very simple beat. It was not all over the place, full of notes. We like to keep the low end simple for one reason, because it's filling up those low frequency ranges, and if you were to make them too fast, too complicated, they literally start to like blur and mud together, because they're just big, heavy instruments when low frequency ranges, and they just, to the human ear, just start to sound like mush. That's one reason. The other one is the low end has traditionally been kind of our foundation, right? Not just for percussion and rhythm, but for harmonics as well, right? The root of our note is usually, not always, but usually played in the low end of a tonal instrument. So, you know, the bass is usually playing the root, and that sets the foundation for the harmonic structure on top of it. And so it's a similar concept with percussion. It's a very the low end is kind of setting that beat. It's setting that simple, steady pace, and then you can put more complex instruments on top of it. And so, as a general rule of thumb, we follow the frequency range up with our complexity. So the bottom of the frequency range, we have the least complex, the least busy, the slowest. I got to be careful how I use the word slow, because of course that's relative to tempo and everything else. But the low end generally is the slower notes. And as you go up to the higher ranged instruments, so all the way up to the hi-hats and the shakers at the very top, they are often the busiest. So they're the ones that are going the fastest. So I just want to briefly look at like some notes written out, just so you get the concept of what I'm talking about here. Again, this is pretty simplistic stuff, but it helps to visualize it. So you can see here when we have our single note, in this case it's the whole note, and then that gets divided into two notes, and then those two notes get divided into two notes, which become the quarter notes, and then the quarter notes each get divided, and they become the eighth notes, right? So just really quick, how I would count out this bottom row here, we count that as 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then the note, the row above it, this one right here, the quarter notes, is just 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the row above that, the half notes, would be 1, 3, right? So you can see what I mean by complexity and busyness and speed, how these all relate now, hopefully, when you see the notes written out. So you would follow the same structure with your orchestration of percussion. So you would have your low end would probably take up these guys right here, the least amount of notes. So your whole notes and your half notes, nice and steady, boom, boom, boom. Your quarter notes might be your mids to your mid-highs. Again, this is just very general. It's just a concept I want you to wrap your head around. It's not like you have to write this way, but the more busier you get, then you raise in frequency range with the instrument. And then your busiest notes will be the highest ranged instruments. So let's look at it again with the piece of music that I wrote. If we look back here, I'm going to bring up my bass drum, and you can probably tell already how simple that is, right? Those are playing 1, 2, right? If we go back to our note chart that I brought up a minute ago, the bass drum is playing a whole note. So let's watch that. Watch how each bar playing a whole note. And then if we bring in our toms, toms get more complicated. Bring in the snare. Cool thing about the snare is it's doing something we're going to get to in a future video. It's doing interesting things with these triplets. So it's kind of like introducing even more interest into the rhythm. And again, this is a topic for a future video that I'll be doing on percussion. And then I'm going to bring up the shaker. And the shaker is, of course, the most complicated one. See the steadiness of this one? And it, of course, is doing 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, the eighth notes. But it's a steady set of eighth notes. So it's if it was played, if the shaker was played on like a bass drum, it would sound like mud, because it would just be like boom, 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 you know? So that's that's the idea, is you simplify the arrangement, you simplify the notes that are being played based on how low their frequency is. So the bass drum gets the most simple. And so that's step 3. And of course, step 3 in this case is like literally the beginning to the whole concept of composing for percussion, right? So I just scratched the very surface, but I wanted to relate it to the concept, the main concept of this video, which is the frequency spectrum. And to, of course, step 1, you want to map your instruments. In this case, we're talking about percussion, but it really applies to any instrument. But in the context of percussion, you map your percussion instruments to where they sit in the larger frequency spectrum. Often, we will break that big spectrum that starts at 20 hertz and goes up to 20 kilohertz. We usually break that up into different bands. So we have our low, our mids, and our highs. And then we often break the mids up into a couple of subsections. Like in this case, I have a low mid and a high mid. So I had 4 bands in my case. So I mapped each one of my drums to those bands so that they kind of hold their own space within the spectrum. Step 3 is I try to make sure the full spectrum is covered if that's what I'm going after. And regardless, though, I want to be aware of the full spectrum, and I want to be aware of which instrument is playing at which frequency ranges. Not just for percussion, but when you start thinking about other instruments, you can see how important this is to be aware of where they're all sitting. And then the final step, which again is just kind of the beginning of really digging into arrangement and percussion, is to make sure when you are writing parts for each instrument, in general, we keep our lowest end instruments the most simplest, and in the case of actual musical notation, they often are doing the whole notes and the half notes, very simple, steady hits, and then we get more complicated and we add more notes as we go up in that range, generally, right? And the highest frequency range, those that are sitting up there in above 8K, like our shakers and our hi-hats, can often be the most complicated. So, as usual, the video turned out longer than I thought. I'm glad I didn't add more ideas to it, because we'd be here for like 3 hours talking about this stuff. So this is just scratching the surface. Hopefully it was helpful just to give you a quick intro to the family of orchestral percussion instruments, as well as the concept of the larger frequency spectrum and where those instruments fit into the spectrum. As well, we kind of covered just quickly how to go about arranging for those instruments. Again, there'll be a lot more in this topic, so this is just the beginning. So I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you come back and watch future videos. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you are notified when part 2 of this video comes out. All right, I will see you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye.